The Ivory Chess Piece. Good evening and welcome back. My name is Arthur, and I will be your guide through tonight's mystery. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments below. Then make yourself comfortable, because tonight his little grey cells are fully engaged, and the truth, as always, is far stranger than anyone in that house is prepared to admit. If you enjoy what we do here, a like and a subscription mean the world. Now, let us go to Wiltshire. Let us find out what is inside that letter. Chapter 1. The House of Silent Moves. The village of Ashford Crossing had not changed in 30 years, and it intended never to change. Its stone cottages crouched along the high street like elderly men hunched against the wind, their gardens immaculate, their net curtains perpetually stirred by the passage of other people's business. The post office smelled of sealing wax and old grievance. The public house served warm ale and cold gossip in equal measure. And Ashford Hall, perched above the village on its limestone ridge like a chess king surveying a board it had already won, remained the seat of the Ardale family, as it had been since the reign of George III, and as everyone assumed it would be until the sun itself grew cold. It was the third week of October, 1934, and the beech trees along the Hall's long drive had turned the precise color of old brandy. The light came sideways across the Cotswolds in that particular autumnal manner. Thin, golden, merciless, illuminating everything it touched with a terrible clarity. Sir Edmund Ardale had invited 12 guests for what he called, with characteristic understatement, a small chess weekend. The invitations, written in his distinctive copperplate hand on cream Smithson stationery, had gone out 6 weeks prior. They had been accepted without exception, which spoke less to the warmth of Sir Edmund's hospitality than to the importance of remaining in his favour. Sir Edmund was 63 years old, erect as a guardsman, and possessed of a face that time had carved into something more interesting than mere handsomeness. His hair was silver, worn short. His eyes were the colour of the winter channel, grey-green and giving nothing away. He had made his considerable secondary fortune in Egyptian antiquities trading during the 20s, supplementing the estate's dwindling agricultural income with an almost ruthless acumen. He was not a man one disliked precisely, but neither was he a man one loved. He was respected, which is a colder and more durable thing. The chess weekend was an annual tradition. Sir Edmund was a player of regional distinction. He had represented Gloucestershire in county matches for 15 consecutive years, and he took enormous pleasure in assembling players of varying caliber and watching the hierarchies that emerged across the board. He kept a display cabinet in the study containing significant chess pieces from his various collections. Jacques Staunton sets in ivory and ebony, a 16th-century Venetian set in rock crystal, and the crown of the collection, a single piece acquired at tremendous expense from a Cairo dealer in 1927, an ivory king from a set believed to have belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte himself, separated from its companions by the chaos of Waterloo, and wandering through a century of private hands before arriving in Sir Edmund's glass-fronted case. The piece was insured for £4,000. It was, Sir Edmund often remarked, the only king he had ever trusted. The guests assembled on the Friday evening. There was Mrs. Dorothea Hartwell, Dora to those who knew her, which was to say everyone, since Dora Hartwell made it her particular business to know and be known. She was 55, a widow of 10 prosperous years, with the kind of handsome, mobile face that would never quite stop being attractive. She had been Sir Edmund's nearest neighbour for 2 decades and, it was whispered, rather more than that during the years before her husband's convenient cardiac arrest. She wore jade earrings that evening and a dress of forest green silk, and she watched Sir Edmund across the dinner table with an expression of calm proprietorship that his other guests found quietly irritating. Beside her sat her nephew, Mr. Gerald Hartwell, 28, whom she had brought at Sir Edmund's specific invitation. Gerald was lean and restless in the manner of young men who have been promised things not yet delivered. He had his aunt's dark colouring, but none of her composure. He played chess adequately. Sir Edmund had corresponded with him about a match, and he had recently completed a degree at Oxford that had produced no visible occupation. He had about him the air of a man awaiting an inheritance, which was precisely what he was. Across the table, Colonel Aubrey Marsh sat with the occupational stillness of a man trained to wait in trenches. He was 60, decorated, and almost entirely ruined. His wife had died in 1929, his investments had followed her in 1931, and he survived now on the meagre rent from a Scottish property he could not afford to sell and would not afford to keep. He had known Sir Edmund since Sandhurst. He played chess with the methodical patience of a military man and was generally acknowledged to be the strongest player present. He had arrived from London on the afternoon train looking as though the journey had cost him considerably more than the fare. Dr. Sylvia Price occupied the seat nearest the fire, a small concession to her recent bout of influenza that Sir Edmund had granted with visible reluctance, as it disrupted the symmetry of his table. She was 47, a physician with a London practice in Harley Street that had survived the Depression through a combination of genuine skill and a wealthy clientele. She was one of the few women in England who had played in open chess tournaments, a fact that Sir Edmund found intellectually admirable and socially peculiar in equal measure. She had thin, clever hands and a way of listening that made people feel either deeply understood or subtly dissected, depending on their conscience. Mr. Leonard Voss completed the inner circle of significant guests. He was Sir Edmund's solicitor, 42, precise in everything, his part, his cuffs, his opinions. He had managed the Ardale estate's legal affairs for 12 years and knew its secrets the way a surgeon knows the interior of a patient, intimately, professionally, and without sentiment. He played chess badly and knew it, which Sir Edmund valued in a solicitor. A man who understood his limitations at the board was a man who understood them elsewhere. The remaining guests were lesser satellites, a pair of county chess players, the local vicar who collected historical board games, two young women who were cousins of someone, their names and faces belonging to that category of person who fills a dining room without quite filling the memory. Dinner was served at 8, prepared by Mrs. Hogg the cook, presided over by Fellows the butler, a man of such perfect professional neutrality that he had achieved, over 40 years of service, something approaching invisibility. The food was excellent, the wine was better, and the conversation moved through the safe territories of the autumn hunting season, the inconvenience of motoring in the wet, and the question of whether the current government had any genuine understanding of the rural economy. Sir Edmund sat at the head of his table and conducted his dinner party as he conducted his chess games, with economy, patience, and the unsettling sense that he was always 3 moves ahead. He was particularly attentive to Colonel Marsh, pressing a second bottle of claret upon him with a warmth that seemed to at least one observer to contain something calculated. He spoke to Dora Hartwell with the ease of long intimacy but without the particular tenderness she seemed to require. He ignored Leonard Voss almost entirely, which was unusual for a man whose affairs the solicitor managed. At 10:30, the ladies withdrew in the old-fashioned manner. Sir Edmund insisted upon it, and the men sat with their port and their varying degrees of honest conversation. At 11, Sir Edmund excused himself. He wished, he said, to show Gerald Hartwell the chess collection before the young man retired, since Gerald had expressed admiration for the Napoleon piece at dinner. This, too, would later be remembered. They were gone 20 minutes. When Sir Edmund returned alone to the dining room, his face had undergone a subtle alteration that only Colonel Marsh, with his soldier's eye for controlled distress, noticed and filed away without comment. Gerald Hartwell appeared in the doorway shortly afterward, said good night with a brevity that bordered on rudeness, and went upstairs. The remaining gentlemen dispersed before midnight. At 7 the following morning, it was Fellows who found Sir Edmund. He was in the study, seated at his desk in his dressing gown, with the leather chessboard open before him, and the pieces arranged in mid-game, a position that Fellows, who understood nothing of chess, nevertheless found deeply strange, since the pieces appeared to have been placed with deliberate care rather than the casual arrangement of interrupted play. Sir Edmund Ardale was dead. His physician, Dr. Price, summoned from her room, determined that death had occurred several hours earlier and that its proximate cause was cardiac failure. She said this with professional certainty. She also said, when pressed, that Sir Edmund had had no history of heart trouble that she was aware of, and that a man of his constitution did not, in her experience, simply stop. The local police constable, Fellows, and Dr. Price were together when they made the second discovery. The glass-fronted cabinet stood open. Sir Edmund's chess collection was intact, every piece in its velvet-lined position, except one. The ivory Napoleon king was gone. In its place, centered with a precision that felt deliberate, almost theatrical, lay a single white pawn from an ordinary Staunton set, a substitution, a message, or, as the constable would later tell the sergeant in Cirencester, the most peculiar thing he had seen in 22 years of rural policing. By the time the sergeant arrived from Cirencester and telephoned his inspector, and the inspector considered the matter and placed a call to Scotland Yard, it was afternoon, and the guests of Ashford Hall had been informed that they were not, for the present, at liberty to leave. By evening, a name had been suggested, a telegram dispatched, and from London, on the last train that would make a reasonable connection through Oxford, there came a small man with a remarkable moustache, a slightly too vivid travelling coat, and a small leather case in which, among other necessities, he kept a tin of tisane and his own particular methods. Hercule Poirot had arrived. Chapter 2. The little man with the large eyes. Poirot's entrance into Ashford Hall was, as his entrances invariably were, both smaller and larger than anyone anticipated. Smaller, because the man himself was physically unimpressive, 5 feet 4 inches of meticulous Belgian, his patent leather shoes catching the hall's lamplight, his travelling coat of a plaid that caused Sergeant Hawkins to blink twice. He carried his case himself, refused the footman's assistance with a small, precise gesture, and stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Hall regarding the space around him with the expression of a man cataloguing an antique shop, methodical, appreciative, and entirely unhurried. Larger because within 4 minutes of arrival he had, without appearing to do so, assessed every person in his immediate vicinity, noted 3 significant details about the entry hall itself, and asked the one question that made Sergeant Hawkins, a solid man with solid habits, suddenly feel that the ground had become slightly less reliable beneath his feet. "This white pawn that was left in the cabinet," Poirot said, removing his coat and handing it to Fellows with a nod of genuine courtesy that the old butler would remember afterwards with something like warmth. "It was placed in the center of the velvet depression where the Ivory King had rested, non?" "Yes, sir," said Hawkins. "Dead center, and the cabinet was locked before the household retired. Sir Edmund locked it himself every evening, sir. Fellows confirms it. Précisément." "And the key?" "On Sir Edmund's person when we found him, sir. On his watch chain." Poirot's eyes, which were very green and very still, and which missed, in the collective experience of those who had encountered them, precisely nothing, moved to the staircase. "Then we have," he said softly, "a murderer of considerable ingenuity, or a very interesting illusion of one. Bon, take me to the study." He paused at the threshold of the study and stood for a full 2 minutes without entering, which caused Sergeant Hawkins considerable professional anxiety. He was simply looking. His gaze moved across the room with the systematic patience of a man reading a text in a language others do not know exists. The desk, the position of the chair, the chessboard and its arranged pieces, the cabinet, now closed, its glass reflecting the grey morning light. The cold grate, no fire laid, though October demanded one. The single brandy glass on the side table, rinsed and set upside down in the manner of someone who had washed it carefully, and the decanter beside it, also rinsed. "Who washed these?" Poirot asked, pointing without touching. Hawkins frowned. "No one, sir. Everything was left as found." "Then Sir Edmund himself." Poirot tilted his head. "A man expecting death, perhaps, who wished to leave no evidence of his last evening's companion, or a man of very particular habits." He paused. "Which was he?" Fellows hovering in the doorway answered without being invited. "Both, sir, if I may say. Sir Edmund was meticulous, but he also never poured brandy after 11. It was his rule. Spirits after 11 disturbed his sleep." Poirot turned to look at Fellows with an expression of pure and unguarded appreciation. "Fellows," he said, "you are a man of remarkable precision. Poirot, he is very glad to make your acquaintance." He moved then to the chessboard and bent over it with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the arrangement of pieces for a long moment. "Sergeant," he said, "you play chess?" "A little, sir." "This position, is it a recognized game?" Hawkins bent over the board with the self-conscious caution of a man aware he is being tested. After a moment he straightened. "I couldn't say, sir. Could be mid-game." "It is not mid-game," Poirot said quietly. "It is the immortal game. Anderson against Kieseritzky, London, 1851. One of the most famous games in the history of chess, notable for the sacrifice of both rooks and the queen by the winning player. Brilliant, unexpected, devastating sacrifice. Someone arranged these pieces with great deliberation. He was silent for a moment, and great knowledge. He then did something that surprised the sergeant considerably. He walked to the window, pushed it open 3 inches, examined the sill with a small magnifying lens produced from his breast pocket, closed the window, and turned around with an expression that was almost cheerful. "Now," he said, "I should very much like to speak with Mrs. Dorothea Hartwell, and then her nephew, and then Colonel Marsh, and after that, perhaps, a cup of very good tea, if your English hospitality extends so far, fellows, and some time alone to think." He met the assembled suspects at 11 o'clock in the morning room, a pleasant space of faded yellow chintz and watercolor hunting scenes that seemed designed to render its occupants comfortable and therefore unguarded. Poirot arranged himself in a wingback chair that was slightly too large for him, which gave him the appearance of a very attentive child at a grown-up's table, and which put everyone who faced him at a slight and indefinable disadvantage. His first impressions were recorded entirely behind his eyes. Mrs. Hartwell, composed, but her composure was working. The jade earrings again, the same pair as last night, which meant she had not slept or had dressed without attention. Her grief appeared genuine. Her anger, which occasionally surfaced beneath the grief like rock beneath shallow water, was more genuine still. Gerald Hartwell, the restlessness of the previous evening had curdled into something more brittle. He sat with his legs crossed and his fingers laced, and he had the look of a man rehearsing answers to questions not yet asked. Colonel Marsh, the stillest person in the room, which in Poirot's experience meant either the most innocent or the most practiced. His eyes were red, not, Poirot suspected, from weeping. Dr. Price, watching everyone with the clinical detachment of her profession, and underneath it something that Poirot recognized from long experience as the particular vigilance of a person who knows more than they have yet disclosed. Voss, pale, not with grief, with something that looked, to Poirot's little grey cells, precisely like fear. Poirot sipped his tea, which was excellent, smiled at no one in particular, and began. Chapter 3. What each one carried. He spoke with each of them separately, in the morning room, while the October wind moved through the beech trees outside, and the hall's other guests maintained the uncomfortable intimacy of people trapped by circumstance in a large house with a dead man. Mrs. Dorothea Hartwell came first, at her own insistence, which told Poirot something immediately. "I will not pretend," she said, arranging herself with great dignity in the chair opposite, "that Edmund and I were merely neighbors. We were a great deal more than that. For 11 years. She paused. "His wife died in 1920. I was widowed in 1924. There was an understanding between us." "An understanding," Poirot repeated pleasantly. "But we should eventually marry." Her voice was level. "Edmund was cautious about appearances. The county, you understand. He wished to observe a proper interval. There was always a reason to wait. First it was the estate's affairs, then his health, then Gerald's Oxford career." Her mouth compressed. There was always something, and most recently, a pause that told Poirot more than any answer could have. "His will," she said at last. "He told me 3 weeks ago that he had made certain revisions. He would not tell me the nature of them. I assumed, I believed they were in my favor." She met Poirot's eyes directly. "He owed me 11 years, Monsieur Poirot. A woman does not give 11 years of her life without some expectation of return." "Quite so. And your nephew Gerald, he was also expecting certain things from Sir Edmund." Something moved across her face, too quickly to name. Edmund was fond of Gerald. He had spoken of assisting him in establishing a legal career. There was talk of a position, of some financial support. Only talk. Gerald has perhaps been expecting the talk to become something more concrete. She smoothed her skirt. "Young men are impatient. And Colonel Marsh, you have known him long." "Aubrey Marsh? 20 years. He and Edmund were old friends, though friendship between men who have borrowed money from one another is complicated." Poirot's eyes sharpened by precisely 1 degree. Sir Edmund had lent money to the Colonel, a considerable sum, some years ago, after Aubrey's investments failed. She said it without malice, which paradoxically made it crueler. "I don't believe it was ever repaid. Edmund was not a man who forgot what was owed to him." Gerald Hartwell came next, with the aggressive casualness of a young man concealing anxiety. He confirmed the visit to the study at 11 o'clock. Sir Edmund had shown him the collection, they had spoken briefly, and he had gone to bed. Yes, the cabinet had been locked. Yes, Sir Edmund had used his key. No, he had not touched any of the pieces. He had merely admired them through the glass. "The Napoleon King," Poirot said. "It was very beautiful, extraordinary, smaller than I expected, about 3 inches. The carving on the crown was phenomenal." He paused, as though replaying the memory against his will. Edmund was rather proprietary about it. Held it in his palm to show me, just for a moment, then put it back and locked the case. Poirot absorbed this without expression. And the conversation, was it agreeable? Gerald's jaw tightened. "Edmund told me he had changed his will. He said he thought I should know before the others did. As a courtesy, he was cutting me out entirely. Said he had decided Gerald Hartwell had sufficient advantages already, and that his estate should benefit those whose need was more genuine." The bitterness was barely controlled. 11 years my aunt has given that man. 11 years. "And what did you say to Sir Edmund?" "I said what any man would say." He met Poirot's gaze flatly. "I told him it was contemptible, and then I went to bed." Colonel Marsh required 2 cups of the Hall's excellent coffee before he became fully present in the conversation. His eyes, Poirot observed, tracked to the study door each time they passed it in the corridor, not with curiosity, but with the reflexive avoidance of a man who cannot look at something directly. He had known Edmund Ardale for 40 years. They had been at Sandhurst together, served in different theatres of the war, renewed their friendship in the 20s when both their fortunes were ascending, Ardale's through antiquities, Marsh's through investments that had seemed, at the time, entirely sound. "I owed him money," he said, with the directness of a man who has decided honesty is less painful than discovery. £8,000, borrowed in 1931 when everything went wrong. I have not been able to repay it. Edmund has been patient." He turned his coffee cup in its saucer. He was always patient. That was the thing about Edmund. He would wait, and when the moment was precisely right, he would act. A pause. "He told me last night, at dinner, not privately, you understand, just in passing so that Voss could hear, that he had instructed his solicitor to call in the debt, formally, legally." His voice was entirely steady. "I cannot pay £8,000. It would mean selling the Scottish property and everything in it. I would have absolutely nothing." "I see," said Poirot. "That must have been very distressing." "It was a death sentence," Marsh said simply, "of a sort. Dr. Price was the most interesting, because she was the most careful. She confirmed that Sir Edmund had no known cardiac history. She had treated him for minor ailments, a chest cold in 1932, some arthritis in the hands, and had found his heart, on the one occasion she had examined it at his request, to be entirely sound. She delivered all of this with the flat precision of clinical fact. "But cardiac failure can occur without prior history," Poirot suggested. "Certainly, particularly under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress, or," Poirot said pleasantly, "under conditions of pharmacological intervention, a silence that lasted precisely 1 second too long. That would require a post-mortem toxicology examination to determine," she said. "Which I have this morning requested," Poirot said, equally pleasantly. "You have no objection, Doctor?" "None whatsoever," she said, and the very completeness of her composure, its utter, professional seamlessness, was the most interesting thing she had yet told him. He spoke with Voss last. The solicitor was pale and precise as ever, but his precision had acquired a slightly desperate quality, as though he was assembling his facts the way a man assembles sandbags against an incoming tide. He confirmed, yes, Sir Edmund had instructed changes to his will 3 weeks ago. No, he was not at liberty to disclose the specifics until after probate. Yes, Sir Edmund had specifically requested that these changes be completed and sealed before the weekend party. They had been. The revised will was at Voss's London office. "One question only, Monsieur Voss," Poirot said. "In your 12 years managing Sir Edmund's affairs, did you ever know him to leave the Napoleon chess piece unlocked, to handle it casually, in the presence of a guest?" Voss blinked. "Never. He wore cotton gloves when he handled it himself. He was— the oils from human hands, he said, were damaging to antique ivory." "Précisément," said Poirot softly, and said nothing further. Chapter 4. the weight of absent things. That afternoon, Poirot walked the grounds of Ashford Hall alone. This was his method, the thinking walk, as he privately termed it, during which the little grey cells conducted their own quiet congress while his feet moved him through the world's irrelevant surfaces. He walked the drive, examined the hall's exterior walls beneath the study window, ate 2 of the small biscuits Mrs. Hogg had sent after him via a kitchen maid who seemed pleased by the assignment, and thought about what was present and, more importantly, what was not. Sergeant Hawkins, returning from Cirencester with the preliminary results of the pathologist's examination, found him at the edge of the kitchen garden, standing before a compost heap with an expression of what appeared to be profound satisfaction. "Digitalis," Hawkins said, consulting his notebook. "Pathologist found traces. Concentrated dose, likely administered in liquid, probably in the last thing he drank. The brandy, they think, though the glass was clean." "The glass was clean because someone cleaned it," Poirot said without turning around. "Washed it and put it upside down, as one does with clean glasses, while Sir Edmund was incapacitated but not yet dead. There was time, you see. Digitalis toxicity does not act in seconds, it acts in minutes. There was time to tidy." He paused. "Your murderer is either a medical person or someone with access to medical knowledge, and someone with either considerable nerve or considerable desperation. These 2 things produce in the end the same behavior." "Digitalis is from foxglove, sir," Hawkins said. "Grows wild in the grounds." "Yes, I noticed." Poirot finally turned around. "But extracting it in usable concentration requires knowledge and preparation. This was not an impulsive crime, Sergeant. This was planned." He began walking back toward the house. "What grows wild in the grounds is not what killed Sir Edmund. What killed Sir Edmund was grown elsewhere, prepared carefully, brought here deliberately. This crime was decided before the weekend began." Back in the house, a second discovery had been made by a housemaid in the course of her duties. In the waste paper basket of Gerald Hartwell's room, beneath a layer of other papers, a torn fragment of a letter in Sir Edmund's handwriting. It had been torn quite deliberately into small pieces, and then someone had apparently changed their mind about discarding it and had attempted to reassemble it. The housemaid, properly trained, had brought the pieces to fellows, who had brought them to Sergeant Hawkins. Poirot examined the reassembled fragment on the morning room table with his lens. The legible portions read, "Cannot continue to defer what has been long decided. Gerald, whatever his merits, the property and its remaining assets to pass entirely to. My decision regarding Dorothea is final and not subject to. Marsh must understand that sentiment has its limits." It was a draft, a private draft, never sent, of what appeared to be a letter intended to precede some larger announcement, the announcement, presumably, of the revised will. "Who else has been in Hartwell's room?" Poirot asked. "Only the housemaid, sir." Poirot set down his lens. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, unexpectedly, "Sergeant, tell me, when fellows found Sir Edmund this morning, the chessboard was on the desk, yes? Already set up in this immortal game position?" "Yes, sir." "All laid out, and Sir Edmund, his hands. How were they placed?" Hawkins checked his notes. "Folded in his lap, sir. Quite neat." The pathologist noted it, said it looked almost arranged. Poirot nodded slowly. "Almost arranged," he repeated. "Oui, almost." He stood up. "I should like to see the chess cabinet once more, if you please." He spent 15 minutes with the cabinet. He examined the velvet impression where the Napoleon King had rested, the subtle outline pressed into the fabric over 7 years of the piece's residence. He examined the lock. He examined the glass. He examined the single white pawn that had replaced the missing king, which Hawkins had preserved in an envelope and now placed on the velvet for Poirot's examination. The pawn was standard, a Jacques Stanton piece, the sort sold by any reputable chess supplier in England, unremarkable, except that on its base, barely visible, requiring the lens, was a tiny scratch, a deliberate scratch, cut with a sharp instrument in the shape of the letter M. Poirot looked at this for a long time. "Sergeant," he said at last, "tonight I think we must have a small gathering, all the principal guests after dinner. In this room." He closed the cabinet gently, and I must first have a long and private conversation with Fellows. That evening, before the gathering, something else occurred that no one had anticipated. Dr. Sylvia Price came to Poirot's room. She knocked at precisely 6 o'clock. She entered, sat down in the single chair without being invited, and said, without preamble, "I administered Digitalis to patients regularly in my practice. It is used therapeutically, in controlled doses, for certain cardiac conditions. I want you to know that I am aware of how that looks." Poirot, who had been reviewing his notes at the small writing desk, set down his pen. "It looks," he said mildly, "as you intend it to look, doctor, which is honest." The question Poirot asks himself is whether this honesty is genuine or strategic. She met his eyes. "Edmund Ardale was blackmailing me," she said. "Has been for 4 years. He knew something about a patient, a death, in my practice, in 1929. The death was accidental, but my handling of the documentation afterward was not. Edmund knew. He used it." She said all of this with the flat steadiness of a woman who has carried weight for a very long time and set it down at last. "I paid him £800 a year, paid from my personal account, recorded as professional consultation fees. And yet," Poirot said gently, "you did not kill him." She looked at him steadily. "No, because you perhaps alone knew that he had told someone, written it down somewhere, that his death would not end the exposure, only transfer it to another hand." She was very still. "Yes, that is exactly why." Poirot nodded. "Merci, doctor. You have been more helpful than you know." He paused. "One question. The scratched initial on the pawn's base, the letter M, had you noticed it before this weekend?" She frowned. "The pawn? I have never examined the pieces closely." "No," said Poirot. "I did not think you had." He picked up his pen. "I will see you after dinner." Chapter 5. The Shape of an Old Sin. Poirot did not join the guests for dinner. He asked for a tray in his room, which Mrs. Hogg delivered personally, a gesture of culinary solidarity that he acknowledged with genuine warmth, and he sat with his tisane, his notes, and the particular focused stillness that meant his little grey cells were doing their most serious work. He had asked Fellows to come to him at 7. The butler arrived on the instant, in the manner of a man who has spent 40 years making his punctuality a form of dignity. "You have been in this house a very long time, Fellows," Poirot said. 41 years, sir. Then you know its history the way a man knows the lines on his own face." Poirot gestured to the other chair, an invitation that Fellows received with visible surprise, and then accepted. "Tell me about the first chess weekend, the one Sir Edmund began. When? 1928? 1927, sir, after he acquired the Napoleon piece." "Yes, and who attended that first weekend?" Fellows considered. "Colonel Marsh, a Mr. Pelham from Oxford. He died since, sir, of influenza. Mrs. Hartwell, and her late husband, and a Miss Oberon, she played for Oxfordshire ladies." A pause. "And a Mr. Martin Voss." Poirot was very still. "Martin Voss," he said, "not Leonard." "Leonard's elder brother, sir. He was Sir Edmund's solicitor before Leonard. Died in 1929. A fall, sir, on the staircase of his London offices." Fellows said it in the tone of a man who has carried a thought for a long time without quite daring to examine it. "Leonard came in to manage the affairs after Martin's death." "Sir Edmund was fond of Martin Voss?" "I would not have said fond, sir. They were involved. In business, sir." Fellows's face remained entirely neutral. "Martin Voss died owing Sir Edmund certain information, documents, about a property transaction in Egypt, documents that Martin had threatened to take to the authorities." Another pause. Longer. "After Martin's death, Leonard Voss produced those documents to Sir Edmund as though they had never been missing. Sir Edmund was grateful enough to give Leonard Voss 12 years of his legal business," Poirot said softly. "Yes, sir, and Fellows, in 41 years. Did you ever see Sir Edmund wear cotton gloves when handling his chess pieces?" "Always, sir, without exception. Even when showing the Napoleon King to a guest?" "Especially then, sir. He had a small glass dome he used when displaying it. He would place the dome and the guest would look through the glass." Fellows met Poirot's eyes. He would never place the piece in a guest's hand. Never. Poirot sat back. In the firelight, his expression was not triumphant. It was, if anything, rather sad. "Tell me," he said, "the letter M, Is there any person in the history of this house to whom that initial is particularly significant? Fellows was quiet for a moment. Martin, he said at last. Sir, if I may, there is something I have not told the police. I did not think it relevant, but last month Sir Edmund received a letter that disturbed him greatly. He burned it in the grate himself, which was unusual. He had me deal with correspondence ordinarily. I could not read what it contained, but afterward he sat very still for a long time. And he said, not to me, sir, I don't think he remembered I was in the room. He said, so it comes round at last. Poirot closed his eyes. So it comes round at last. The old sin returning. Martin Voss, dead 5 years, and someone who knew why. He opened his eyes. Fellows, he said, you have been the most valuable person in this house. I am grateful. He rose. Now I must think, and then I must act. He sat alone for 2 hours. He thought about chess, about the immortal game, about the sacrificed rooks and the sacrificed queen, and the king who walked into an inescapable position. He thought about what was absent: no cotton gloves, no glass dome, a king removed from its case by the one person who had actually held it. He thought about the initial scratched into the pawn's base, not a clue left by accident, but a message, deliberate and pointed. He thought about a man found with his hands folded neatly in his lap, which is not the posture of a man who died in distress, but the posture of a man laid out by someone who felt, in some complicated way, that he deserved that small dignity. He thought about the revised will, and the 3 people it had damaged: Dora Hartwell, Gerald Hartwell, Colonel Marsh. He thought about Dr. Price, who had motive and knowledge, and who had done the most dangerous thing possible, told the truth. He thought about Leonard Voss, who was afraid, and about what, precisely, he was afraid of. And then, with the methodical precision of a player executing a long-prepared combination, he saw it. All of it: the shape of the crime, the architecture of the deception, the human heart at its dark and complicated center. He was not, when he understood it fully, entirely surprised. He was, as he so often was at these moments, rather sorrier than he had expected to be. Chapter 6. The Grey Cells Speak. At 9 o'clock, Poirot stood before the cold grate of the study and reconstructed the night of Sir Edmund's death with the precision of a man who was not there but sees more clearly for it. Sir Edmund had poured brandy for one guest after 11 o'clock. He had done so with deliberate intent, an intention Poirot could now read as clearly as printed text. He had shown Gerald Hartwell the Napoleon King not out of generosity, but out of cruelty, a last display of what the young man would not inherit. He had mentioned the called-in debt to Colonel Marsh, in Voss's hearing, not carelessly but calculatedly, to ensure the humiliation was witnessed, documented, indelible. Sir Edmund Ardale had spent the final evening of his life methodically burning his bridges, not out of malice in the simple sense, out of the particular malice of a man who has decided that his legacy will be order, and that order requires the settling of accounts, and that accounts include the human ones. But Sir Edmund had not known that one of his guests had brought something to Ashford Hall with a purpose older and more patient than any of the weekend's other grievances, Digitalis prepared in advance. This was the key. Not something mixed in a desperate moment, something brought deliberately in a small glass vial, tucked into a traveling case among the legitimate medicines that a medical bag might plausibly contain. The Digitalis had been in the brandy Sir Edmund poured for his guest in the study, the same guest who had washed the glass afterward, who had the knowledge to understand that the glass must be washed, and the steadiness of nerve to wash it while a man was dying in his chair, and the particular care to set it upside down as clean glasses are set, so that in the morning it would appear as though no glass had been used at all. The Napoleon King. This was the element that had seemed initially to complicate everything, but Poirot saw now that it did not complicate, it clarified. The king had not been stolen for its value, it had been removed as a symbol, as a last move in a private game of much longer duration than one weekend. The scratched initial on the pawn, M for Martin, was not an accident or an anonymous message. It was a signature, a declaration. This is what this is about. This is what was never forgotten. And the folded hands, the careful, deliberate folding of a dead man's hands into a posture of rest. That was the detail that had caught Poirot's attention from the beginning, because it was not the act of someone covering their crime. It was the act of someone who had complicated feelings about the person they had killed. The immortal game, arranged on the chessboard, the game of brilliant sacrifice, of deliberate giving away to achieve an inevitable end. It was not random, it was not merely showing off, it was an explanation, a confession almost. Look, it said. Look at what I gave, and what I was willing to lose, to arrive at this. Poirot stood at the chessboard and looked at the arranged pieces for a long moment. Then he went to find Sergeant Hawkins and told him to assemble everyone in the drawing room at 10 o'clock. There was one detail still to verify. He sent a telegram to London, to a colleague in the records office at Scotland Yard, and the reply came within the hour because Poirot had used the particular wording that indicated urgency, and because his credit with Scotland Yard, after many years, was considerable. The reply confirmed it. Martin Voss had not died in a fall. The inquest had returned accidental death, yes, but the investigating constable at the time, now retired, living in Eastbourne, had written in his private notes, never admitted to the official record, that the angle of the fall was inconsistent with the declared position, and that Martin Voss had, in the weeks before his death, confided to his housekeeper that he feared Sir Edmund Ardale. So it comes round at last. Yes, Poirot thought. After 5 years it came round. Chapter 7. The Gathering at Ashford Hall. The drawing room of Ashford Hall was designed for autumn evenings. Its walls were hung with faded crimson damask. Its lamps cast the warm, slightly amber light that makes every face look both more beautiful and more guilty than it is. The fire had been lit, properly this time, in contrast to the cold grate in the study, and it contributed a restless, leaping quality to the light that suited, Poirot thought, the nature of what was about to occur. They arranged themselves with the unconscious instinct of people who are frightened. The innocent clustered together, the guilty seeking proximity to the innocent as camouflage. This too, Poirot noted. Mrs. Dorothea Hartwell sat with Gerald beside her, a gesture of solidarity that was also, perhaps, a gesture of mutual protection. Colonel Marsh sat apart, with the separateness of a man who has stopped pretending to be comfortable. Doctor? Price sat near the window, her hands folded with the deliberate composure of a woman who has already confessed one truth and is measuring the cost. Leonard Voss stood by the bookshelves, not quite able to make himself sit down. The other guests, the county chess players, the vicar, the cousins, were present but peripheral, their faces showing the confused anxiety of people caught in an event whose dimensions they cannot quite assess. Sergeant Hawkins stood by the door. Poirot stood before the fireplace. He began, as he sometimes did, with a compliment. "You have all been very patient," he said pleasantly, "and you have all been very helpful, even those of you who intended only to deceive, because deception, you see, is itself informative. Poirot, he learns as much from what people choose to hide as from what they choose to reveal." He let his gaze move around the room without settling. This case presents itself as 2 crimes. The death of Sir Edmund Ardale, and the theft of his Napoleon chess piece. But this is not in fact 2 crimes. It is 1 crime with 2 parts, and the second part is the key to understanding the first. "Edmund died of heart failure," Mrs. Hartwell said. Her voice was controlled. The doctor confirmed what the pathologist has since corrected," Poirot said gently. "Sir Edmund died of digitalis poisoning, administered in the brandy he drank in his study on Friday evening. This is no longer a matter of question." The room absorbed this. Voss sat down. "I will eliminate first those who did not commit this crime, though I want each of them to understand that Poirot is not blind to their other affairs." He turned to Gerald Hartwell. "You had motive, the revised will, the anger of a young man who believed himself betrayed. You were with Sir Edmund in the study at 11, but you did not give him the digitalese, because the digitalese was administered after you left, and because you, Monsieur Hartwell, despite your anger, did not know that the Napoleon King must never be touched without gloves. You handled it. Sir Edmund placed it in your hand, as Gerald confirmed he did. Your fingerprints are on the piece, wherever it now is. A guilty man would not have created that evidence." Gerald stared. "He did put it in my hand," he said slowly. "Just for a moment, I thought it was generous." "It was not generous," Poirot said quietly. "It was Sir Edmund ensuring that if the piece went missing, you would be the primary suspect. He was using you even in the last hour of his life." He paused. "You should perhaps be less angry at his death than you are." He turned to Colonel Marsh. You had motive, the debt, the public humiliation, the threatened ruin. You had means, potentially. A military man has resources, but you have an alibi of the most unpromising kind. You drank considerably more of Sir Edmund's excellent claret than was advisable, and you were heard by two separate witnesses, the vicar and fellows, snoring in the library armchair from 11:30 until well past midnight. A man committing murder does not snore through it. A very small smile, and you did not know Sir Edmund's habit of washing glasses, of the precise, upside-down domestic tidiness of it. Marcia's shoulders dropped by approximately 1 inch. He said nothing, but something in his face changed. Mrs. Hartwell. Poirot's voice softened slightly. 11 years. A woman does not give 11 years and feel nothing. You had perhaps the strongest emotional motive of all, but you were with the other ladies from 10:30. And the housemaid who turned down your bed can confirm you were in your room by midnight and did not leave it. I also do not believe, he added, with a gentleness that surprised the room, that you would have folded his hands. That particular detail required a specific feeling, not the feeling of a woman finally losing patience, but something older and more complicated than that. He turned to Dr. Price. You I must address with some care, because you have been honest with me, and honesty deserves its proper acknowledgement. You had means, beyond any doubt. You had, we now know, cause to want Sir Edmund dead. 4 years of blackmail is cause enough. But you came to me freely and told me the truth, and that is not the action of a murderer. A murderer does not hand the detective the most incriminating fact about herself before he finds it. A pause. Also, you did not know about Martin Voss, and Martin Voss is at the heart of this. The name moved through the room like a cold draught. Voss stood up again. His face was the color of old plaster. Martin Voss, Poirot said, and now his voice was very quiet, was Leonard Voss's elder brother. He was Sir Edmund's solicitor until 1929, when he died in a fall on a staircase, a fall that the official record calls accidental, but which was not accidental. Martin Voss had been threatening to expose Sir Edmund's involvement in an illegal property transaction in Egypt, documents that could have destroyed Sir Edmund. Martin died before he could use them. That is a very serious accusation, Voss said. His voice was careful, stripped of everything except the effort of being careful. It is not an accusation against you, Monsieur Voss, Poirot said. You were 27 when your brother died. You were given your brother's practice, his clients, his position, by Sir Edmund, who could have destroyed you instead, since you produced those documents to him afterward. You have spent 12 years in a state of, what? Complicity, fear, both? He studied the solicitor's face. You knew what Sir Edmund had done, and you could not prove it, and you were afraid that the same thing might happen to you, should you become inconvenient. Voss said nothing, which was, Poirot reflected, also a kind of truth. Bon. Then let us speak of who did commit this crime. He turned to face the room fully. The Napoleon chess piece was not stolen, he said. It was reclaimed by someone who knew its history, not the Cairo dealer's history, not the Napoleonic legend, but a private history. Sir Edmund acquired that piece in 1927 from a dealer in Cairo. But he acquired it, and this is what took time to discover, because the original transaction was conducted under a false name. From an estate that was not legally the dealer's to sell, the piece had been held in trust, in the family of Martin Voss. A sound from somewhere in the room, barely audible, barely human. Martin Voss was a chess player, Poirot continued. He was in fact a passionate collector of historical chess pieces. The Napoleon King belonged to him, purchased legitimately by his grandfather in 1870. After Martin's death, it disappeared from his estate inventory. Sir Edmund had acquired it not from Cairo, but from Martin directly, as collateral against a debt that Martin could not pay because Sir Edmund had engineered the circumstances that made payment impossible. He paused, taking a dead man's most prized possession after arranging that man's death. This is the kind of act that does not sleep, mes amis, not in the conscience of the person who knows about it. He looked around the room, and his eyes settled. The murderer of Sir Edmund Ardale is Leonard Voss. Chapter 8. The Truth That Fits the Heart. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which something irrevocable has been said. Voss did not run. He did not shout. He sat down very carefully, like a man ensuring that he occupies the smallest possible amount of space, and he looked at his hands on his knees, and he said, in a voice of considerable steadiness, "Tell me how you know." "Willingly," said Poirot, "because the how in this case is inseparable from the why, and the why is the only part that matters." He sat down himself, which he had not done before, and this shift, from the theatrical position before the fireplace to the quieter, eye-level intimacy of a chair, changed the nature of the room entirely. "You spent 12 years managing Sir Edmund's legal affairs," Poirot began. "You had access to every document, every account, every secret, including the documents that proved Sir Edmund's involvement in your brother's death. Not an accident, but a murder arranged to look like one, in the way that only a patient man of resources can arrange these things. And you kept those documents, secretly, safely, not to use but to hold, as insurance, as the one thing that meant Sir Edmund, who knew you held them, could not do to you what he had done to Martin." Voss raised his eyes. They were dry, which was, Poirot thought, itself a kind of eloquence. "Then, 3 weeks ago, Sir Edmund summoned you and told you of the changes to his will. In the course of that meeting, or in the course of your subsequent review of his new instructions, you discovered something that broke the careful equilibrium of 12 years. He was leaving everything to a chess foundation," Voss said. His voice was flat. "The entirety of the estate, the collection, everything. He had written a provenance note, to be published posthumously, explaining how he had acquired the Napoleon piece, a self-serving, laundered version of the acquisition. It would have been the public record. It would have made him a benefactor and a connoisseur." Something crossed his face, old and concentrated. "Martin would have been erased, completely. My brother would have simply not existed in any version of that piece's history." "And so you decided," Poirot said quietly, "that if Sir Edmund would not acknowledge what he had taken, what he had done, then you would take it back." "I took the piece," Voss said. "I had planned only to take it, to return what was Martin's to Martin's name, to donate it properly, in his memory, to the British Museum, with its true provenance. That was all I intended." He stopped. His hands tightened on his knees. "But Edmund showed it to that Hartwell boy. He put it in the boy's bare hands and laughed about the oils." He breathed. "He had killed my brother for that piece, and he was laughing about the oils on a boy's hands." "And so the plan changed," Poirot said. "Not immediately. I still planned only to take it. I had my own key to the cabinet. Edmund had given me 1 year ago to manage the insurance documentation. He had forgotten, or he believed I would never use it." A pause. "I went to the study at 1 in the morning. Edmund was still awake, still there. I had not expected that. He was sitting at his desk, setting up the chessboard. When he saw me, he wasn't frightened. He was amused. Something shifted in Voss's face, the last layer of composure giving way to something rawer. He said, he actually said, 'Leonard, come to watch me play through the immortal game. Pull up a chair.' As though I were nobody, as though Martin were nobody, as though nothing had any weight for him whatsoever." The room was very still. "I had brought the digitalis for myself," Voss said. "I have a cardiac arrhythmia, a mild one. I carry a prepared solution for emergency use. My physician prepared it." He looked at Poirot directly. "I did not plan to use it on him. I want you to believe that, not because it helps me legally. I understand it doesn't, but because it is true. I did not arrive in that room intending murder." "I believe you," Poirot said, and he meant it. He poured the brandy himself. He offered me a glass, and then he said, as he handed it to me, "You know, Leonard, I've been thinking of retiring you. You've been useful, but I think someone younger, someone without your particular encumbrances." Voss's voice was almost without inflection now. He meant Martin. He meant the documents. He was telling me he had found another way around them, that he had made himself safe, that I was being discarded, exactly as Martin had been discarded. A long silence. I put the solution in his glass, the one he had poured for himself. It was very simple. He was looking at the chessboard. No one in the room spoke. He began to feel unwell within perhaps 10 minutes. I set up the pieces, the immortal game, while he sat. He understood, I think, toward the end, what I had done, but he said nothing. He simply stopped. Voss's voice for the first time fractured very slightly. I folded his hands. I don't know why. It seemed he deserved to look as though he had simply gone to sleep. Despite everything, I could not I folded his hands, I washed the glass, I took the Napoleon King from the cabinet and left the pawn. He paused. The M on the pawn's base, I had scratched it years ago. A private thing, in case he ever tried to replace Martin's pieces with imitations, a way of marking what was real. He looked at Poirot. I didn't think anyone would understand what it meant. Poirot understood, Poirot said gently, because Poirot always asks, who is absent? And in this house, in this story, the most important person was a dead man that no one mentioned. He rose. Monsieur Voss, he said, you will go with Sergeant Hawkins now. The Napoleon King, you will tell Sergeant Hawkins where it is, and arrangements will be made regarding its proper disposition. The British Museum, I think, as you intended. Voss rose too, with the careful movements of a man uncertain of his legs. I knew when I did it, he said, that I would not escape. I did not particularly want to. No, Poirot said. I did not think you did. Sergeant Hawkins moved forward. Voss went without resistance. The room remained frozen for a long moment after the door closed. Then, with the small deflating movements of people returning to themselves, it began to breathe again. Colonel Marsh passed a hand over his face. Good God, he said. Dr. Price said nothing. She sat looking at the fire with an expression that Poirot recognized. The expression of a person who has been oppressed by a powerful man for a long time and who is trying to understand what relief, after so many years, is supposed to feel like. Dora Hartwell was weeping quietly with the controlled dignity of a woman of her generation. Not for Edmund, Poirot thought, but for the 11 years, and for what they had and had not been, and for the discovery that the man she had perhaps loved was not entirely the man she had believed, and never entirely not. Gerald Hartwell sat looking at his own hands, the hands that had held the Napoleon King, with the expression of a young man to whom several things have just become clear simultaneously. Poirot stood before the fire for a moment longer. He was thinking about chess, about the immortal game, the game of brilliant sacrifice, where you give away everything that seems valuable to arrive at the only move that was ever going to matter. He was thinking about Martin Voss, who had played no part in this weekend and had nevertheless been its protagonist from the beginning. He was thinking, as he often thought at these moments, that justice and the law are not always the same shape, and that the wise man acknowledges this difference without letting it paralyze him. Leonard Voss would be tried. He would, in all probability, be convicted. Whether he would hang was a question for judges and juries and the particular mercy of the season. Poirot was not sanguine, and he did not pretend to be. But the Napoleon chess piece, Martin Voss's Napoleon chess piece, would go to the British Museum with its true provenance, with Martin's name upon the gift record, with the small permanent acknowledgement that a man had lived and loved a beautiful thing, and been wronged and been remembered, in the corridor, collecting his hat and coat from fellows who helped him into the coat with the grave ceremony of a man performing a final service. Poirot paused. Fellows, he said, in 41 years, did you love this house? The butler considered the question with appropriate seriousness. I loved what the house could have been, sir, he said at last. There is a difference. Précisément, said Poirot softly. There is always a difference. He walked down the long drive in the October dark, the beech leaves releasing themselves from the trees in small, unhurried companies, and he did not look back at the lights of Ashford Hall. He had, as he always did, arrived at the truth. Whether the truth was also the end of the story was another matter entirely. The stories, in his experience, never quite ended. They simply moved into rooms that were no longer his to enter. The Napoleon King, when Sergeant Hawkins traced Voss's London flat, was found in a velvet-lined box on the solicitor's desk, positioned facing east as though overseeing the city. At its side, a handwritten card in neat legal script. Property of Martin James Voss, 1892-1929. Beloved brother. Returned at last. Hercule Poirot read this detail in the sergeant's report 3 days later, in his London flat, over his morning tisane. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, Très bien, Martin. Très bien, and turned to his next case. Fine,